The aroma of fresh bread filled the kitchen of the Sinclair mansion as Mary adjusted the temperature of the industrial oven with the precision that only 15 years of experience could provide. Her calloused hands, marked by small scars from old burns, moved gracefully between pots and trays in a familiar dance that began every morning at 5 o'clock. Her graying hair, always carefully tied in a firm bun, framed a face marked as much by time as by the frequent smiles she bestowed upon everyone who crossed her path. On the counter beside her, perched on a high stool, Emma scribbled yet another of her colorful drawings, her little tongue poking out the corner of her mouth in absolute concentration as she waited for her mother to finish her morning shift. "Mommy, look, I drew you making that chocolate cake that everyone loves," exclaimed Emma, proudly raising the paper. Mary leaned over the drawing, observing the irregular but lively lines her daughter had traced. On the paper, a plump, grey-haired figure smiled in front of a brown rectangle that undoubtedly represented her famous chocolate cake with red fruit syrup. "It's beautiful, my love. You captured even the flowery apron that Grandma gave me," replied Mary, feeling her heart melt at her little artist's natural talent. Emma smiled, revealing the gap where she had recently lost her front teeth, and quickly began another drawing, this time carefully choosing a celestial blue crayon. The Sinclairs had always been good employers, Mary thought, as she prepared the elaborate lunch she would serve later. Mrs. Beatrice, the family matriarch, insisted that Emma could stay in the kitchen after school, knowing that Mary had no one to leave her daughter with during the hours when the community daycare was closed. The girl grew up between those white-tiled walls, learning the difference between basil and oregano before she could even write, filling notebooks and more notebooks with drawings of the delicacies she saw her mother prepare. "One day I'll make a recipe book all illustrated by me, Mommy," she would often say, her eyes shining with the absolute certainty that only children possess about their dreams. The kitchen clock read almost noon when Catherine Sinclair entered, her expensive perfume mingling with the aromas emanating from the stove. "Mary, dear, I need you to prepare something special for tonight. Richard is bringing an important client for dinner, someone who could change the course of the company," she said, her restless hands adjusting the pearl necklace on her slender neck. Mary nodded, already mentally planning a menu that would impress any guest. "Leave it to me, Mrs. Beatrice. I'll make that red wine beef fillet that Dr. Richard loves so much, with that milk pudding you adore for dessert," she replied, observing the approving smile spread across her employer's face. Emma lifted her eyes from her drawing, now speckled with golden stars that sparkled in the soft window light, as if about to leap off the paper. Her fingers were stained with ink, and a small blue smudge had landed on her cheek, but she didn't seem to mind, totally absorbed in her work. With a shyly satisfied smile, she raised her head and looked at Mrs. Beatrice, who was organizing some utensils on the nearby counter. "Mrs. Beer, can I show my new drawings to Dr. Richard when he arrives?" asked Emma, her small voice full of innocent hope, as if she expected that simple gesture could make a difference in the grandeur of the adult world. Beatrice, with her carefully coiffed hair and face illuminated by the golden afternoon light, approached the girl. She crouched down to her level, gently caressing Emma's dark, ever-tousled locks, a testament to the girl's constant energy. "Of course you can, dear," Beatrice replied, her soft, enveloping voice conveying more than mere words of encouragement. "You know Richard always says you have the talent to become a great artist one day." Emma smiled, her eyes shining with renewed enthusiasm. Her whole body seemed to fill with energy and confidence from Beatrice's simple praise. She looked at the notebook, as if the employer's words had given her strength to create something even more beautiful, more worthy of being shown. Determined to make something special, Emma picked up a new colored pencil, as if the entire world was within her reach at that moment. From where she stood in the kitchen, Mary watched the scene with a heart full of gratitude. The smell of the lunch in preparation mingled with the soft aroma of fresh herbs she was chopping, and she felt a wave of love and patience as she saw her daughter, so full of life and dreams. For her, the simplicity of that afternoon was a gift, a routine that filled her with joy, even in the most mundane tasks. But unbeknownst to her, she was about to be torn from that peace. The approaching night would bring something that would transform Mary's quiet existence into an endless nightmare, and the tranquility she felt at that moment would soon be nothing but a distant memory. The night promised to be special at the Sinclair mansion. Crystals gleamed under the soft light of the candelabras, reflecting the golden glow emanating from the carefully arranged floral arrangements on the extensive dining table. In the kitchen, Mary orchestrated the final preparations with the precision of a maestrina, her experienced hands dancing between pots and platters as she coordinated her team. Emma, seated in her usual corner near the kitchen window, drew with her colored pencils, occasionally lifting her eyes to admire the incessant movement that took over the environment. The rich aroma of the red wine sauce mingled with the delicate notes of fresh herbs, creating a symphony of aromas that promised to enchant the guests of the gala dinner. "Mom, can I help decorate the plates?" Emma asked, her eyes shining with the same passion for culinary art that she saw daily in her mother. Mary smiled, momentarily pausing her supervision of the sauce preparation to approach her daughter. "Not today, my love. The guests are very important, and I need to ensure that every detail is perfect. But how about you make a special drawing of the dinner? That way we can keep this night forever in your colors," she suggested, stroking the girl's hair. Emma nodded enthusiastically, immediately beginning to sketch the outlines of what promised to be her artistic interpretation of the elegant occasion. The guests began to arrive promptly at 8 o'clock, their murmurs of admiration echoing through the corridors of the mansion as they were received in the sumptuous main hall. Mary observed discreetly through the kitchen door as the waiters circulated with trays of meticulously prepared canapes. Among those present, Mr. Robert Whitmore, the important businessman that Dr. Richard so wanted to impress, stood out. Tall and imposing in his impeccable suit, he conversed animatedly with the other guests, his confident smile revealing perfectly aligned teeth that contrasted with his tanned skin. The night was unfolding exactly as planned, each dish being received with expressions of delight and effusive praise that reached the kitchen. Emma had fallen asleep in her improvised corner, her colored pencils still scattered around the unfinished drawing that portrayed the guests in childlike but surprisingly expressive strokes. Mary covered her daughter with a soft shawl she kept for such occasions, allowing herself a moment of tenderness before turning her attention to the dessert that was about to be served. It was at that instant that the first screams cut through the refined atmosphere of the party. Chaos ensued with the speed of lightning. Mr. Whitmore collapsed onto the table, knocking over glasses and plates. His body trembled uncontrollably, and his breathing became irregular. Panic gripped the guests who tried to seek help. When the paramedics arrived, it was too late. The silence that followed was even heavier than the previous screams. The arrival of the police transformed the elegant mansion into a crime scene. Forensic experts in white coats moved methodically around the environment, collecting samples from the dishes and photographing every detail. Mary watched it all in a state of shock, embracing Emma, who had awakened frightened by the commotion. The detective in charge of the case, a man with a grave expression and penetrating gaze, approached her with a paper in hand. "Preliminary analyses indicate the presence of a toxic substance in the food," he announced, his voice laden with authority. "As the person responsible for preparing the food, you are temporarily detained for questioning." The words fell like blocks of ice on Mary, while Emma, still drowsy and confused, clung more tightly to her skirt. The nightmare was just beginning. Catherine Sinclair observed the crime scene with shrewd eyes, her elegant posture contrasting with the chaos that had befallen the mansion. Dressed in a navy blue silk ensemble that accentuated her slender silhouette, the judge's wife, Charles, delicately held her hands crossed over her lap, although her fingers twisted nervously, betraying her apparent calm. Her calculating gaze alternated between Mr. Whitmore's now covered body and Mary's trembling figure, who still embraced Emma protectively. For a brief moment, a flash of cruel satisfaction crossed her green eyes, so fleeting that no one but herself could have noticed. "It was her! I saw everything!" Catherine's voice cut through the atmosphere like a sharp blade, causing everyone present to turn in her direction. Perfectly timed tears began to stream down her well-made-up face as she advanced towards the investigators. "I was passing by the kitchen earlier and saw her put something strange in the food. I thought it was just seasoning, but now..." Her voice failed dramatically, and she covered her face with her hands in a studied display of despair. The detective immediately approached, his notepad in hand. while the other guests began to murmur among themselves, casting accusatory glances in Mary's direction. Mary felt the ground disappear from beneath her feet as Catherine's words echoed in her ears. "No, that's not true. I would never. Please, you have to believe me." Her words came out punctuated by growing panic, as Emma clung even tighter to her skirt, beginning to cry in fright. The detective, however, had already made his judgment. With a nod, 2 police officers approached, handcuffs in hand. "Mrs. Mary, Judge Charles Sinclair's wife has just made a very serious accusation against you. With the preliminary evidence and now an eyewitness, I'm obliged to take you into custody," he declared, his voice devoid of any emotion. Catherine watched the scene with a perfectly rehearsed expression of distress, leaning theatrically on the arm of one of the guests. "I should have said something sooner, but who could have imagined? So many years of service. Charles always said we shouldn't trust servants blindly, but I never wanted to believe." Her voice trembled at the precise measure between indignation and sorrow, while her eyes followed with veiled satisfaction the moment the handcuffs closed around Mary's wrists. At that instant, Emma let out a devastating scream that echoed through the mansion. "Mommy, don't take my mommy," her little hands frantically trying to reach Mary as one of the officers held her back. The metallic sound of the handcuffs closing seemed to echo throughout the mansion, cutting through the air like a sharp blade. The shocked murmurs of the guests formed an indistinct murmur, a chorus of disbelief and barely concealed horror. Some brought their hands to their mouths, others exchanged glances, unable to look away from the scene unfolding before them. At the center of that cruel spectacle, Mary was pulled unceremoniously by the officers, her legs faltering with each step. Her eyes, wide with shock, roamed frantically around the illuminated hall, seeking a single face, Emma's. The little girl sobbed uncontrollably in the arms of the older cook, struggling with childlike desperation. "Mommy!" Her voice cut through the atmosphere like a lament, her small hands outstretched in a futile plea. Her face was flushed red, bathed in tears, and each sob reverberated in Mary's chest like a knife slowly plunging in. "Please don't take my mommy." Catherine, motionless in the center of the hall, placed a delicate hand over her chest, her expression carefully composed with grief. The guests around her murmured words of indignation, but no one dared to challenge the version of events that Catherine spread like poison. "Poor child," she murmured to those closest, her voice imbued with false compassion. "But what can we expect from someone capable of poisoning an innocent man?" The accusation hung in the air like an invisible specter, and Mary, stifled by unbearable anguish, was pushed out. Outside the mansion, the flashes of photographers exploded like thunderclaps, immortalizing the moment she was shoved into the vehicle. With a shattered heart, her last sight was of Emma trying to run to her before being held back. Then the vehicle door closed. Distant from the mansion, the metallic creak of the gates echoed through the cold corridors of the women's penitentiary, marking another dawn in Mary's new reality. The rough orange uniform irritated her skin as much as the whispered words from the other inmates as she passed. Murderer, poisoner, boss killer. Her fingers, once skilled in the preparation of refined dishes, now occupied themselves in counting the marks she made on the wall of her cell, marking each day away from Emma. The nights were the worst. The silence amplified her thoughts, and every shadow seemed to take on the form of her daughter's frightened face on that fateful night. "Visit for you, cook," announced the guard, her tone laced with contempt as she unlocked the cell. Mary rose quickly, her heart racing at the possibility of seeing Emma, but her eyes met only her sister Teresa, who awaited her in the visiting area with a devastated expression. "I got the social worker to let Emma stay with me for now," Teresa said, her hands nervously clutching her worn purse. "But she won't stop crying, Mary. She spends the nights calling for you, barely eats. Her drawings now are only in dark tones." Each word was a stab in Mary's chest as she struggled to maintain her composure, while imagining her little artist trading her vibrant colors for somber shades of loneliness and fear. The public defender assigned to her case rarely appeared, and when he did, he brought only bad news. "The evidence is circumstantial," he explained on his last visit, flipping idly through the thin folder containing her case, "but Mrs. Sinclair's testimony carries a lot of weight. Wife of a respected judge, no apparent motive to lie." His voice trailed off in a resigned shrug, as if Mary's fate were just another file to be processed through the system. At night, alone in her cell, she mentally retraced every moment of that dinner, searching in vain for any detail that could prove her innocence. Catherine's face, with its mask of fabricated concern, haunted her ever more frequent nightmares. During the collective shower time, where dignity was as scarce as hot water, Mary tried to make herself invisible. "Hey, chef," shouted one of the older inmates, her voice dripping with scorn. "How about whipping up a special dinner for us too?" "I promise I won't taste it first." Laughter echoed off the stained tiles, mingling with the sound of water and the sobs Mary could no longer contain. In that moment, huddled under the icy spray, she was no longer the respected cook of the Sinclair mansion. She was just another prisoner, separated from everything she loved by steel bars and poisonous lies. "Mrs." Eleanor watched with a heavy heart as Emma sat once again by the window of her modest apartment, the colored pencils scattered around her like forgotten toy soldiers on a battlefield. The elderly neighbor from the third floor, a gray-haired lady with a gentle smile, had offered to care for the girl as soon as she heard what happened. Now 3 weeks later, her maternal heart ached to see the once vibrant little artist lost in a world of increasingly darker colors. The joyful drawings of before had given way to heavy, somber strokes, where solitary figures always appeared separated by lines reminiscent of prison bars. "Emma, dear, don't you want to try this chocolate cake I made?" "Mrs.?" Eleanor asked, trying for the third time that day to get the girl to eat properly. Emma only shook her head no, her fingers clutching the black pencil she used to mark the paper. "It's not like Mom's," she murmured, her small voice laden with a sadness no child should know. "Mom's has a special secret that makes it taste better. She said she would teach me when I turned 9. The words trailed off into a stifled sob, and once again the black pencil gained strength over the paper, creating shadows where there had once been only light. The nights were especially difficult. Emma would often wake up calling for Mary, her nightmares populated by confusing images of police and handcuffs. "Why doesn't Mom come back, Mrs. Eleanor?" she would ask during those frightened early hours, her large eyes shining with unshed tears. "I promise I'll clean my room every day. I promise I won't ask to stay up late drawing anymore. I promise I'll eat all my veggies." Her childish promises, born of the belief that perhaps some fault of hers was the reason for her mother's absence, broke the hearts of all who heard them. During the day, Emma refused to play with the other children in the building, preferring to sit at her observation post by the window. Her eyes constantly scanned the busy street below, as if expecting to see Mary appear at any moment, with her welcoming smile and arms always ready for a hug. The distant sounds of children's conversations and laughter no longer held any allure. They seemed to belong to a world that no longer existed for her. The sketchbook, once filled with colorful dreams of becoming a great artist, now held only unfinished portraits of her mother, each one interrupted at the moment when tears made it impossible to continue. The strokes trembled on the crumpled pages, the faces becoming blurred where drops of sadness had stained the paper. In a corner of the last page, a phrase written in a shaky hand summed up all her childish despair. "Come back, Mum. Please come back." The words were slightly smudged, as if she had run her fingers over them after writing them, trying to erase them, or perhaps wanting to hold them there, trapped on the paper, like a spell that could bring Mary back. The staccato clacking of Catherine's heels echoed down the prison corridor like a metronome announcing the arrival of death. Her impeccable Chanel suit and discreet but expensive jewelry created a grotesque contrast with the peeling walls and the stench of cheap disinfectant. When she stopped in front of Mary's cell, her French perfume mingled with the heavy prison air, creating an even more stifling atmosphere. Mary, who was sitting on her narrow bed mentally replaying the events of that fateful night one more time, slowly raised her eyes, feeling her stomach churn as she recognized the elegant silhouette of her former employer. "What a decay!" Catherine let the words slip from her red-painted lips as her eyes scanned the tiny cell with barely concealed disdain. Her smile, thin as a blade, cut the air between them as the guard opened the gate for her entrance. "You know, Mary, I came here out of pity. Pity for your daughter, really. Emma, isn't it? Such a talented child. It would be a pity to waste all that potential because of her mother's mistakes." Each word was pronounced with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel, calculated to inflict maximum pain. Mary felt her hands tremble but remained silent, observing the mask of feigned concern that Catherine wore so well. Catherine stepped closer, her voice lowering to an icy whisper that froze the air between them. "Your daughter will forget about you soon. A maid like you should never have meddled in the lives of the rich." Her green eyes gleamed with cruel satisfaction as she watched the impact of her words. "Perhaps in time she won't even remember your face. Children have that wonderful ability to overcome trauma, don't they? Especially when they're so young." Catherine adjusted a diamond bracelet on her Dawson wrist, the glitter of the stones reflecting off the dirty cell walls like tiny blades of light. It was in that moment, watching the near-orgasmic pleasure Catherine displayed in her cruelty, that all the pieces fell into place in Mary's mind. The dinner, the sudden death, the immediate accusation. It had all been meticulously planned. Her eyes widened with realization, and for the first time since her imprisonment, she felt something other than despair growing in her chest. A burning certainty began to ignite in her gut, replacing fear with a fierce determination. Catherine must have sensed the change, for her smile faltered for a split second before recomposing itself. "For you planned all of this." Mary pronounced each word slowly, her voice hoarse from weeks of crying, finding a strength she didn't know she still possessed. Each syllable carried the weight of the suffering, the injustice, the seething outrage that burned within her like a fire about to consume everything. Her reddened, tired eyes held Catherine's gaze, refusing to look away, to submit to the fear that woman had always instilled. Catherine tilted her chin up slightly, studying Mary like a predator assessing a wounded prey. The slight arch of her eyebrow conveyed disdain, but there was something else there, a flicker of irritation at the audacity of the woman who, in her view, should have already been broken. "But you know what, Catherine?" Mary went on, her breath hitching with the weight of emotion, but her determination solid as steel. "I'm going to prove my innocence. Even if it's the last thing I do in this life, I'm going to show the truth." For an instant, Catherine's face remained impassive. Then she let out a soft laugh, a musical, venomous sound that echoed off the cold cell walls. "Ah, Mary," she murmured, shaking her head as if amused. "You've always had that naive way of seeing the world, but go ahead, try. I would love to see what you can do behind those bars." She turned, her heels clicking against the concrete floor. But Mary saw it. A brief flicker in the woman's green eyes. Not fear, but a fleeting discomfort, a hint that her words had struck a nerve. And in that moment, alone in her cell after the sound of Catherine's heels finally faded, Mary clenched her fists and closed her eyes. She made a silent vow to Emma. She would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. If Catherine thought she could destroy her, she was about to find out that Mary wasn't so easy to bring down. The flashes of light exploded like tiny lightning bolts in the courthouse foyer where Catherine had called a press conference. Her delicate features were carefully made up to appear haggard, with soft, strategically placed shadows under her reddened green eyes. She wore a somber grey suit, no jewelry except her wedding band, a meticulously staged production to convey sobriety and vulnerability. Reporters swarmed around her like bees to a poisonous flower, their microphones extended to catch every rehearsed word she uttered in a choked voice. "I never imagined someone we considered part of the family could do something so terrible." Catherine let a solitary tear roll down her well-tended cheek, pausing dramatically to dab her face with a silk handkerchief. "Mary always seemed so devoted, so grateful for everything we did for her and her daughter. But now I realize that beneath that facade of humility lurked a corrosive envy." The journalists lapped up every word, their pens scribbling furiously across notepads as the cameras captured each carefully studied expression of pain and disappointment that crossed the judge's wife's face. Catherine's performance reached its crescendo as she described with theatrical precision how she had discovered Mary's plot. "That night, I passed through the kitchen and saw her adding something strange to the food. At the time, I couldn't believe what my eyes were seeing. How could I suspect someone we saw every day, someone who prepared our meals, who witnessed our most intimate family moments?" Her voice quavered at just the right moment, and more strategic tears began to fall. "If I had spoken up then, perhaps Mr. Whitmore might still be alive. That silence will haunt me forever." The comments on social media were exploding in real time. Messages like, "Justice for Whitmore" were reaching the top trends while the interview was being broadcast live. Public opinion, which was initially divided due to Mary's impeccable reputation, was starting to lean decisively against the cook. "It's always the closest ones," some commented. "Envy is indeed a poison," others said. Catherine watched her own image on the lobby monitors, pleased to see how her tears glistened perfectly under the camera lights. Her plan was working exactly as planned. "What hurts me the most," she continued, her voice lowering to a whisper laden with false emotion, "is to think of her daughter. How can a mother be so selfish as to risk her own daughter's future out of envy and greed?" The silence that followed was filled only by the frantic sound of cameras firing, the flashes illuminating Catherine's face at carefully planned angles. Her gaze, slightly clouded by rehearsed commotion, scanned the reporters gathered in front of her. The microphone trembled subtly in her hands, a small detail, but carefully calculated to reinforce her supposed fragility. She embraced her own arms, as if trying to protect herself from an invisible pain, her fingers sliding lightly over the thin fabric of the impeccably chosen morning dress. The play of light and shadow projected her silhouette against the somber background of the press conference, creating the illusion of someone deeply affected by the horror of the situation. The journalists eagerly took notes of every word, absorbing her narrative as if it were the only possible truth. The spectacle was complete, and Catherine was its leading star. However, under the meticulously constructed curtain of sadness, a cold glimmer danced in her eyes. Backstage of the media circus she had orchestrated, an almost imperceptible smile played at the corners of her lips. A brief smile, but laden with certainty. The mask of the suffering victim was working perfectly. Every look of compassion, every expression of indignation directed at Mary was one more step towards the denouement she had planned. Very soon no one would doubt the cook's guilt any longer. Very soon her victory would be sealed. Judge Charles Sinclair's office was a sanctuary of fine wood and leather-bound books, where the weight of law and tradition hung in the air like a tangible presence. Seated in his leather chair behind the imposing mahogany desk, he was rereading Mary's case file for the 10th time, his graying eyebrows furrowed in concentration as he tried to ignore the sound of Catherine's heels, pacing back and forth on the Persian carpet like a restless feline. The framed photograph on his desk showed a happier moment. The whole family gathered during a dinner prepared by Mary, their smiles eternalized in an instant that now seemed to belong to another life. "Darling, you must take this case." Catherine leaned over the desk, her mellifluous voice laden with studied urgency. "No one better than you to ensure justice is served. You were there, you saw what happened. You know every detail of this terrible story." Her long, elegant fingers slid over the scattered documents, pausing on Mary's photograph attached to the file. Charles adjusted his reading glasses, feeling the weight of the decision he had to make compress his chest like an invisible vice. "Catherine, you know there's a conflict of interest here. She worked in our home for years." Catherine cut off his words with an impatient gesture, her green eyes sparking with an intensity Charles knew all too well. "Precisely because of that, who better to judge someone who betrayed our trust in such a way? You saw how she manipulated all of us, how she took advantage of our kindness. Whitmore was your friend, Charles. He dined at our house every month." Her voice trembled on the last sentence, a performance so convincing that even Charles, who had known her for 20 years, felt momentarily moved. The judge rubbed his tired face, feeling the weight of each of the 3 sleepless nights since the case had landed on his desk. "The judicial code of ethics is very clear about cases involving acquaintances," he tried to argue, but his voice already carried the hesitation of one who begins to yield. Catherine sensed the breach and attacked with the precision of a predator. "And the ethics of letting a murderer go free on technicalities? What will the papers say when they learn you refused to serve justice for Whitmore, that you preferred to abstain when you had the chance to ensure she pays for what she did?" Each word was like a drop of poison, seeping into the judge's conscience, mingling with his own doubts and biases, carefully cultivated by Catherine over the past few weeks. Charles finally raised his eyes from the documents, meeting his wife's expectant gaze. The warm yellow light of the desk lamp cast irregular shadows over the scattered papers before him, highlighting each signature, each official seal that transformed those sheets into something much heavier than mere bureaucracy. It was a sentence before the trial, a verdict sealed by Catherine's subtle and relentless influence. At that moment, all his certainties about justice and impartiality seemed distant and hazy, dissolved like smoke amid the weight of the sweet, yet poisoned words his wife had been whispering to him for weeks. The oath he had taken years ago to judge without fear or favor now seemed a faded memory, buried under the pressure of keeping up appearances, of protecting his reputation, his marriage, his position. "You're right," he declared, trying to ignore the growing weight in his chest. His voice found a firmness he did not truly feel, as if he were rehearsing a role instead of voicing his own conviction. "I will preside over this case. It is my moral obligation to ensure she does not escape the punishment she deserves." Catherine smiled, a calculated and impeccable gesture, but her eyes remained cold, glimmering with a silent triumph. She watched, with an almost tangible satisfaction, as her husband stamped the document officially appointing him as the judge for the case. Another piece fell perfectly into her meticulous plan. Every move up until then had been architected with precision, and now all she needed to do was sit back and watch, as justice, molded by her own hands, bent to her will. Emma sat at Miss Eleanor's kitchen table, her small fingers tapping restlessly on the worn wood as the television broadcast yet another interview with Catherine. The melodious voice of the judge's wife, laden with false emotion, filled the room, but something about that tone didn't sound true to the girl's sensitive ears. Catherine's tears seemed different from the real tears Emma saw in her mother's eyes during prison visits, or the ones she herself shed every night clutching her pillow. There was something wrong, something her childish mind couldn't explain, but her heart felt with the crystalline clarity that only children possess. The news showed footage from the fateful dinner, filmed by one of the guests moments before the tragedy. Emma watched the scenes intently, her large eyes fixed on the screen as her memory tried to reorganize the events of that night. She remembered sitting in her usual corner in the kitchen, her colored pencils scattered across the table as she drew the party's activity. Her mother was busy with dinner preparations, and Emma did what she always did, recording everything in her colorful strokes, capturing every detail of the surroundings with a child's unconscious precision. "I drew everything that night," Emma murmured to herself, her small voice laden with sudden realization. She got up abruptly, startling Miss Eleanor's cat napping nearby, and ran to the room where she was temporarily sleeping. Her sketchbook was kept like a precious treasure inside her school backpack, along with the colored pencils her mother had given her on her last birthday. With trembling hands, Emma began flipping through the pages, passing by recent drawings filled with dark, sad colors, until she reached that specific night. Her little heart raced as her fingers slid across the paper, searching for the exact moment her memory was trying to grasp. Finally, she found the drawing she was looking for, the mansion's kitchen portrayed in childish but surprisingly detailed strokes. Her mother was there, drawn with all the love and admiration Emma felt, busy by the stove. The kitchen assistants appeared as smiling figures manipulating platters and cutlery. And then, in a corner of the page that had once seemed insignificant, Emma noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. There it was, almost hidden among the other elements of the drawing, a detail that her childish mind had unconsciously registered on that fateful night. Emma brought the drawing closer to her eyes, hardly daring to breathe as she studied that specific piece of the page. The paper trembled slightly between her small fingers, and the dim light from the lamp cast elongated shadows over the desk. Her heart was beating hard inside her chest, accelerated as if she were running against time. The more she looked, the more certain she was that there was something crucial there, something that could finally help her mother. The colored lines hastily drawn on that fateful night now seemed to contain a hidden secret, a truth that no one else had seen. The childish stroke, once just a reflection of her imagination and memory, now became a concrete clue. Every detail jumped before her eyes, as if screaming to be understood. Her parted lips murmured a loose thought, a thread of reasoning she couldn't yet organize. Her hands began to tremble even more, a mixture of excitement and fear spreading through her body. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, trying to organize her thoughts, but all she felt was a knot tightening her throat. Then, A single tear silently rolled down her cheek and fell onto the paper, slightly blurring the colors of the drawing. Emma held her breath as she saw the stroke dissolve a little, as if that could erase the truth she had just found. What she had just discovered in her own drawing was much bigger than her 8-year-old mind could fully comprehend, but her heart knew. There was the key to proving her mother's innocence. Now she just needed to find a way to make everyone believe her before it was too late. The yard of the women's penitentiary was a mosaic of shadows and tension that afternoon. Mary walked alone during the sunbath hours, her hesitant steps echoing on the stained concrete, as she tried to keep as far away from the other inmates as possible. Her arms hugged her own thin body, as if trying to protect herself from the cold wind that cut through the air, carrying with it the smell of moisture and fear that seemed to permeate every inch of that place. In recent weeks, she had noticed different looks in her direction, whispers that ceased when she approached, an atmosphere of veiled threat that made her instincts scream in alert. On the other side of the bars surrounding the prison complex, Catherine watched the scene from inside her luxurious imported car, a satisfied smile playing on her perfectly painted lips. Next to her on the passenger seat, a brown folder lay open, revealing the criminal record of Veronica Scarr, a notorious inmate known for her violence and influence inside the prison. On top of the file, a thick envelope containing money awaited delivery, along with specific instructions on how to teach a lesson to Mary. Catherine adjusted her sunglasses, watching as a corrupt guard discreetly approached her car. The plan unfolded with the precision of a Swiss watch. During dinner in the mess hall, Mary sat in her usual spot, listlessly stirring the bland food on her plastic plate. The deafening noise of utensils and chatter drowned out any other sound, making it impossible to hear the approaching footsteps behind her. The first blow caught her completely off guard, a precise punch to the base of her ribs that knocked the wind out of her lungs. Before she could catch her breath, strong hands dragged her to a less lit corner of the mess hall, where other inmates quickly formed a human barrier, preventing the guards from seeing what was happening. Veronica Scarr commanded the attack with brutal efficiency. Her calculated blows meant to cause maximum pain without leaving permanent or fatal marks, exactly as Catherine had specified. "This is to teach you that a nosy little maid's place is on the ground," she hissed between blows, her words echoing strangely similar to Catherine's refined tone. Mary tried to protect herself, curling into a fetal position as kicks and punches rained down on her body. In her mind, Emma's image overlaid the pain, giving her strength not to scream, not to give her aggressors the satisfaction of hearing her laments. The attack was swift and brutal. Mary tried to protect herself, but there was no way to escape. The muffled environment of the prison silenced any call for help. When they finally let her go, her strength drained away, and she fell to the cold floor, feeling her entire body throbbing with pain. The world was spinning, her vision becoming a blur of shadows and muffled laughter. By the time the guards finally noticed the commotion and intervened, Mary was already lying on the ground, semi-conscious, her orange uniform stained with red. The smell of iron mingled with the strong odor of sweat and mold, making the air heavy. Veronica and her accomplices had dispersed like ghosts in the crowd, moving with the tranquility of those who know they will never face consequences. In the makeshift prison infirmary, the flickering fluorescent light cast angular shadows over the rusty gurney where Mary lay. An indifferent nurse cleaned her wounds with apathetic movements, the cotton soaked in antiseptic, burning her injured skin. Mary clenched her teeth, refusing to utter a single moan. She fought back the tears that threatened to fall. She wouldn't give Catherine the satisfaction of knowing she had managed to hurt her, neither in body nor in soul. She kept her eyes fixed on the peeling ceiling, breathing deeply. If Catherine thought this would break her, she was deeply mistaken. Emma was sitting on her makeshift bed in Mrs. Eleanor's apartment, her eyes fixed on the drawing she had made on the night of the dinner. The late afternoon light lazily streamed through the window, making the colors of the paper seem more vivid, almost as if the depicted scene could come to life at any moment. Her little fingers repeatedly traced the outlines of the figures, as if trying to extract more memories from those childlike strokes. It was then that a memory crossed her mind like a bolt of lightning. Her mother's old cell phone, the one Mary had left behind so she could play at taking pictures of her drawings. On that dinner night, Emma had taken some pictures without anyone knowing. Now, her heart raced as she remembered that. The cell phone was stashed at the bottom of her school backpack, waiting to be rediscovered. With trembling hands of anticipation, Emma rummaged through the colorful backpack, her heart beating faster and faster as she pushed aside notebooks, pencils, and small childhood treasures. At the bottom, wrapped in a handkerchief that still held the scent of her mother's soft perfume, she found the device. It was an old model, with a cracked screen in one corner and a battery that never lasted long. Emma pressed the power button, silently praying there was still some charge left. The screen flickered a few times before turning on fully, drawing a sigh of relief from the girl. Her small fingers, now more skilled with technology than they were a few weeks ago, navigated to the photo gallery. There were dozens of records of her drawings, some blurry selfies she had taken while playing, and then her heart almost stopped, the photos from the dinner. The images were slightly shaky, typical of an 8-year-old photographer, trying to balance on her tiptoes to get a better angle through the crack of the door, but they were clear enough. Emma zoomed in on one of the photos, her eyes widening as she realized she had captured the exact same moment she had drawn in her notebook. The girl brought the cell phone closer to the drawing, comparing the two records of that fateful instant under the dim light of the desk lamp. The dark screen of the device reflected the trembling glow of the lamp, casting elongated shadows on the walls of the small room. Emma blinked a few times, trying to absorb the connection between the images before her. Something inside her chest told her that there, in those two ways of capturing reality, one through her child's eyes translated into colorful strokes, the other through the discreet lens of the old cell phone, was the key to helping her mother. Her heart raced with the growing certainty that this discovery was more important than anything she had ever done. The drawing, so innocent and spontaneous, now seemed like a silent scream, a denouncement hidden among colored pencils and childish scribbles, and the photo, even if erased from the dead cell phone's screen, still existed. It was there, stored in the device's memory, waiting to be seen, waiting to tell the truth. Emma felt the weight of the revelation, even without fully understanding all of its implications. Her chest swelled with a mixture of fear and hope, and her small fingers, once hesitant, now firmly held the cell phone and the drawing. With extreme care, as if protecting a treasure, she slid both under her pillow, feeling the slight bulge under her head as a silent reminder of her mission. Her lips curved into a shy smile, the first real smile in weeks. Maybe, just maybe, she had found a way to bring her mother back home. She closed her eyes, clinging to that hope as if it were the only thing capable of keeping the darkness that threatened to engulf her at bay. Determination shone in Emma's eyes as she tried, for the third time that day, to make an adult listen to her discovery. First, she went to the police station accompanied by Mrs. Eleanor, her drawing and the cell phone carefully stored in her school backpack. The officer on duty barely lifted his eyes from his desk when she started talking, her small but firm voice trying to explain about the photos and the drawing. "Dear, this is a serious case. We don't have time for childish games," he said, his condescending tone cutting Emma's words like a sharp pair of scissors. Mrs. Helena squeezed her hand in solidarity, but Emma could see that not even she truly believed an 8-year-old girl could have discovered something important. At school during recess, Emma tried to show her evidence to teacher Sandra, who had always been kind and attentive to her. "Look, teacher, here in the drawing there's someone near the drink table, and in the photo too," Emma explained, her small fingers eagerly pointing out the details. The teacher smiled that smile adults reserve for children telling fanciful stories, patted her hair, and suggested she focus on her studies instead of making up theories. Emma felt the tears burning her eyes, but she swallowed them with the strength of someone who had already cried too much in the past few weeks. Not even the public defender representing her mother wanted to waste time looking at what she had discovered, dismissing her with a distracted wave while taking an apparently more important call. Sitting on her bed at the end of that frustrating day, Emma held her mother's cell phone with the silent determination she had inherited from Mary. The battery was almost drained, and she knew she needed to look at the photos one more time before the device turned off completely. She zoomed in on the first photo, then the second, her watchful eyes searching for any detail she might have missed. On the third image, something caught her attention, a reflection in the decorative mirror strategically positioned on the wall of the hall. Emma zoomed in on the image as much as the old cell phone allowed, her heart racing as the image quality adjusted and revealed a scene that her childish mind took a few seconds to fully process. There, captured by the mirror's reflection and the innocent photograph of a child, was Catherine. Not the teary Catherine from the television interviews, but a furtive Catherine, her elegant hands moving discreetly over the glass that would be served to Mr. Whitmore. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the photo had frozen the exact moment when something, a fine white powder, fell from her fingers into the drink. Emma felt her entire body tremble with the discovery, her young mind finally grasping the magnitude of what she had in her hands. It was the proof her mother needed, the evidence all the adults had ignored, accidentally captured by a child's curiosity with an old cell phone. At that moment, as if conspiring against her discovery, the cell phone screen flickered one last time before going completely dark. The battery had run out. The sudden brightness vanished from the screen, leaving Emma immersed in the silent darkness of the room. The device was now just a cold object in her trembling hands, a weight almost as heavy as the truth she had just uncovered. She clutched the cell phone to her chest, her small fingers closing around it, as if she could protect it from the cruel reality that had just revealed itself before her eyes. Her heart was beating so hard it seemed to want to escape, resonating in her ears like distant drums. The air in the room suddenly felt heavier, and she had to take a deep breath to keep from being swallowed by the avalanche of fear and uncertainty that consumed her whole. Now she knew the truth. She had seen it with her own eyes, connected the pieces that the adults seemed unable or reluctant to see. But what good was having the answer if no one would listen to her? How could she save her mother when everyone in power refused to believe the word of an 8-year-old child? Emma felt a lump tighten her throat. Her watery eyes scanned the dark room, searching for a solution where there was none. The weight of the revelation and the helplessness she felt was almost too much for her little shoulders to bear alone. But she knew she couldn't give up. Not now, not when her mother needed her more than ever. With one last sigh, she wiped her eyes on the back of her hand and held firmly onto the only certainty she had. Somehow, she would make everyone listen. Mrs. Eleanor was preparing dinner when Emma burst into the kitchen, the old cell phone clutched in her small hands as if it were the most precious of treasures. The grey-haired woman observed, intrigued, as the girl connected the device to the charger with fingers trembling with anxiety. The minutes it took for the cell phone to turn on seemed like an eternity to Emma, who didn't take her eyes off the screen, murmuring quiet words of encouragement to the old device. The smell of roast in the oven filled the room, painfully reminiscent of the days when her mother cooked, but Emma barely noticed, focused on her mission. "Mrs. Eleanor, please, I need you to see this," implored Emma, as soon as the cell phone finally turned on, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and hope. The neighbor approached, wiping her hands on her flowery apron, touched by the intensity in the girl's gaze. Emma navigated to the photo gallery with the dexterity of someone who had done it hundreds of times, until she reached the image she had discovered. Her small fingers zoomed in on the photo, focusing on the mirror reflection that revealed Catherine at the drinks table. Mrs. Eleanor adjusted her reading glasses, leaning in to examine the image more closely, when something in her expression changed drastically. "Good Lord," whispered Mrs. Eleanor, her hands beginning to tremble as she took the cell phone from Emma's hands to look closer. That man, Robert Whitmore. Now everything makes sense. The neighbor staggered to a chair, her legs seeming to weaken under the weight of realization. Emma watched, confused but hopeful, as the woman murmured disconnected words, as if piecing together an invisible puzzle. I knew I had seen that name before. Whitmore. He was the main business rival of Catherine's husband. He was about to close $1 million deal that would ruin the Sinclair company. Mrs. Eleanor's words, who had previously worked as a secretary in a law firm specializing in business law, fell like domino pieces, revealing a much larger and more sinister picture than Emma could have imagined. The young girl listened intently as Mrs. Eleanor explained, her young mind absorbing every detail with the clarity that only children possess. Her big eyes roamed the neighbor's face, as if trying to decipher every nuance of what was said, every fragment of truth that fit together like pieces of an invisible puzzle. The dim kitchen light cast long shadows over the table, where the documents and printed photo lay, and the night silence made every spoken word even more intense. Whitmore was negotiating the purchase of a company that the Sinclairs also wanted. Mrs. Eleanor continued, her voice dropping lower as if fearing someone might overhear, even within the safety of her own apartment. It was a multi-million-dollar deal. It even made the news back then. I remember reading about it when I still worked at the law firm. At the time, it just seemed like another dispute between businessmen, nothing out of the ordinary. Emma leaned forward, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table, feeling they were reaching the crucial point. But now, with him out of the way, Mrs. Eleanor stopped abruptly, as if she had just put the last pieces together. Her eyes met Emma's, and in that moment there was no more doubt. Horror and understanding mingled in her expression, and the room seemed to grow smaller, suffocating. She pulled Emma into a tight embrace, feeling the girl's small hands tremble against her back. "Dear, you don't know what you've just uncovered," she whispered, her voice thick with urgency and fear. Tears began to form in her eyes. "We need to act fast. Your mother can't spend another day in that prison." Outside, a distant rumble of thunder echoed, like an ominous omen of what was yet to come. The newsroom of the Truth newspaper was buzzing with the usual chaos of a late afternoon, when Mrs. Eleanor strode through the glass doors with Emma firmly held by her hand. The environment was a symphony of ringing phones, furiously tapping keys and overlapping conversations, all immersed in the strong aroma of reheated coffee. The woman walked determinedly to the desk of Donald Parker, an investigative journalist known for uncovering cases of corruption and social injustice. His workspace was a small organized chaos, with stacks of documents, newspaper clippings, and a wall covered in photos and notes connected by red threads, like a web of conspiracies waiting to be revealed. "Robert, we need your help," began Mrs. Eleanor, her voice carrying an urgency that made the journalist lift his eyes from his screen immediately. He knew that lady well. She had been his trusted source in several stories about corporate fraud during the years she worked at the law firm. Robert adjusted his thin-framed glasses on his nose, observing with curiosity the girl who was partially hiding behind Mrs. Eleanor. "Remember the Whitmore case? The cook accused of poisoning?" she continued, lowering her voice and leaning over the table. "We have something you need to see." Emma, understanding her cue, took her cell phone out of her backpack with trembling but determined hands. The next few minutes were filled only with the sound of the three's contained breathing, as Robert meticulously examined the photograph on the old cell phone. His experienced investigator's eyes scanned every detail of the image, focusing especially on the revealing reflection in the mirror. From time to time, he consulted his notes and newspaper clippings, muttering loose words as he made mental connections. "This is pure dynamite," he finally declared, a glint of professional excitement lighting up his tired eyes. The corporate merger, Whitmore's convenient death, the judge's wife presiding over the case. It all fits perfectly. Robert rose from his chair in a brusque motion, running his hands through his disheveled hair, his gaze fixed on an invisible point on the wall. His brain was working at high speed, connecting each piece of the puzzle forming before him. The fluorescent lamps flickered slightly, casting elongated shadows over the cluttered furniture of his office. The smell of reheated coffee mingled with old paper, and the dust accumulated in the files he had been consulting over the past few hours. "We need to act with extreme caution," he explained, crossing his arms and then starting to pace back and forth. His voice was laden with a weight that wouldn't dissipate, a balance between concern and determination. He knew they were about to meddle in something much bigger than a simple murder case. Catherine Sinclair is not just a judge's wife. She is part of one of the most powerful families in the city. People like her do not sustain themselves merely by money, but by the fear they are capable of imposing. He stopped in front of the desk, his eyes analyzing each scattered document as if searching for a clue he had not yet noticed. "We'll need more evidence, something irrefutable. Build a solid case before publishing anything, because if we take one false step, she'll bury us before we can even scream for help." His eyes rested on Emma, who was watching him attentively. Her small fingers gripped the edge of the chair, her gaze wavering between hope and apprehension. Robert bent down slightly to be at the girl's level and smiled, even though he knew there were not many certainties to offer. "But don't worry, little one. You've just given us the first piece of a puzzle that's going to keep a lot of powerful people up at night." He could already visualize the headlines, feel the weight of the story that was about to explode. It was the kind of case every investigative reporter dreamed of uncovering, a conspiracy involving power, money, and above all, an injustice that needed to be corrected. The early morning hours had already advanced when Donald Parker finally found the connection he was looking for. His desk was covered with old documents, bank records, and newspaper clippings that formed a mosaic of evidence. The journalist had spent the last 72 hours immersed in a frantic investigation, following a trail of money and secrets that had led him to a startling discovery. On his computer screen, a series of bank transfers from abroad revealed a suspicious pattern of movements between shell companies linked to Catherine Sinclair and Robert Whitmore. The journalist scribbled a few more notes in his already full notebook, his hands trembling slightly with the magnitude of what he had uncovered. "Mrs. Eleanor, I need you to come to the newsroom immediately." His voice sounded urgent on the phone. Whitmore wasn't just a business rival. He and Catherine were partners in a much bigger scheme. As he awaited the arrival of the former secretary, Robert organized his findings. Documents showed that Catherine and Whitmore had embezzled millions in overpriced contracts, using their companies as a front for an elaborate money laundering scheme. However, in the weeks leading up to the fateful dinner, Whitmore had begun to show signs of remorse, making suspicious contacts with the district attorney's office. His death had not only been convenient, it had been a desperate need for silencing. Mrs. Eleanor arrived at the newsroom to find Robert in a state of feverish agitation. "Catherine didn't kill Whitmore because of the business merger," he explained, spreading documents across the table. "She killed him because he was about to blow the whistle on a corruption scheme involving dozens of politicians and businessmen. The dinner was just the perfect opportunity, with Mary as the ideal scapegoat." The lady brought her hands to her mouth, horrified by the magnitude of the conspiracy. Emma, who had insisted on accompanying her even at that late hour, watched everything with wide eyes, clutching her sketchbook to her chest as if seeking comfort. Robert continued explaining how Catherine had used her influence and her husband, the judge's name, to cover up years of criminal activities, turning Whitmore's murder into a masterpiece of manipulation. "I'm publishing everything tomorrow," Robert declared, saving the files to his flash drive and making backup copies. "I have enough evidence to take down not only Catherine, but half of the city's corrupt elite." He handed a sealed envelope to Mrs. Eleanor, his hands still trembling with the adrenaline of the discovery. "If anything happens to me, deliver this directly to Prosecutor Marcus Ellison. He's the only one we can trust." Emma watched the journalist pocket the flash drive and put on his worn coat, preparing to leave. "I'll just stop by home to pick up some additional documents and come back to finalize the story," he said, heading toward the door of the nearly empty newsroom. That was the last time anyone saw Donald Parker. The following morning, the newsroom of the newspaper The Truth, normally a vibrant chaos of voices, phone calls, and furious typing, was enveloped in an unsettling silence. Robert's chair remained empty, his desk in disarray exactly as he had left it the night before, as if he were about to return at any moment. But he didn't return. The journalists exchanged tense glances. Some whispered among themselves, others avoided uttering Robert's name aloud, as if recognizing the danger that now lurked in that space. The strong smell of cold coffee hung in the air, mingled with the fear no one dared to verbalize. Lady Eleanor was sitting beside the empty table, her fingers clenched around the sealed envelope that Robert had handed her. She felt a knot of worry tightening her throat, making it difficult even to breathe. Her heart was beating too fast, as if it knew that Robert's fate had been sealed from the moment he dared to defy Catherine Sinclair and her accomplices. Beside her, Emma stared at the journalist's empty chair, her little hand gripping the strap of her backpack tightly. There was something about his absence that the girl understood instinctively, an emptiness that could not be filled with words of comfort. The look she gave Lady Eleanor was of someone who already knew the truth, even if she didn't have the courage to say it out loud. The silence that hung over the newsroom was not just the absence of sound. It was a muffled lament, the sinister weight of another deadly secret that threatened to engulf anyone who dared to come too close to the truth. 3 days passed without news from Donald Parker. The empty chair in the newspaper's newsroom seemed to scream a deafening silence every time Emma visited it, accompanied by Mrs. Eleanor. The journalist's computer had been taken by the police for investigation, But the girl knew with the sharpened intuition that children possess that nothing would be found. The files that Robert had shown, the evidence he had gathered so meticulously, had all disappeared along with him. All that remained was the sealed envelope he had handed to Mrs. Eleanor, hidden in a locked drawer in the neighbor's apartment, weighing like lead on their consciences. The television in Mrs. Eleanor's living room was broadcasting yet another interview with Catherine, her melodious voice laden with false concern as she commented on the journalist's tragic disappearance. Emma watched the screen with eyes that had aged decades in just a few days, her fingers unconsciously clutching the old cell phone that held the incriminating photo. "He disappeared because of me," the girl whispered, breaking the heavy silence that hung in the apartment. "If I hadn't shown him the photo." Her voice faltered, choked by a weight no child should have to bear. Eleanor approached to comfort her, but Emma pulled away, determination replacing the tears in her eyes. Emma walked to the window, observing the city that seemed to carry on with its normal life, oblivious to the unfolding drama. The sketchbook lay open on the table, showcasing her latest creation, a portrait of her mother behind bars, next to Donald Parker disappearing into the shadows. The dark colors dominating the drawing perfectly reflected the young artist's state of mind. "No one else is going to help us, are they?" she asked, her small voice carrying a painfully adult understanding of the situation. Mrs. Eleanor didn't answer immediately, her hands busy nervously twisting her apron, unable to lie to soften the harsh reality. Emma turned back to her sketchbook, her small hands carefully sliding over the worn pages, as if touching a precious treasure. The paper exhaled a faint scent of dried wax crayons and paint, a familiar perfume that, until a few months ago, meant security and happiness. Now it represented something much bigger, the only chance to save her mother. She gently flipped through until she found the sketch she had made that fateful night. Each trembling line, each colored stroke, was a piece of a puzzle no one else seemed willing to put together. Next to it, she placed the printed photo from the cell phone, the definitive proof that Donald Parker had risked his own life to protect. The two pieces of evidence lay side by side on the table, silent witnesses to the truth the world refused to see. Her eyes alternated between the images, absorbing every detail as her young but determined mind began to formulate a plan. The room around her seemed to fade away, and all that mattered was what lay before her. The cold night wind swayed the curtains of the open window, casting dancing shadows on the walls. But Emma felt no fear. She clenched her fists, taking a deep breath before speaking. "If no one else can help," she declared, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, "then I'll have to do it alone. Mom always says that sometimes we need to be our own hero." Mrs. Eleanor, who had been watching silently, felt a tightness in her chest as she saw the 8-year-old girl transform before her eyes. Pride and worry mingled in her gaze, but she knew she couldn't stop Emma now. With precise movements, Emma began organizing her evidence inside a colorful folder. The weight of childhood slipped away with each action, giving way to the courage of someone who knew there was no more room for hesitation. She was no longer just a child. She was a little warrior determined to fight giants, even if she had to do it alone. Lawyer Michael Reynolds' office was modest and cluttered, with piles of cases accumulating on every available surface, and an old fan lazily spinning, barely moving the heavy afternoon air. When Emma entered, accompanied by Mrs. Eleanor, he barely looked up from the documents he was analyzing. He was the same man who weeks earlier had dismissed the girl without paying attention to her theories. But today, something was different. The disappearance of journalist Donald Parker had been front-page news in all the papers, and an unsettling unease had been disturbing the lawyer's sleep ever since. The name Catherine Sinclair, which frequently appeared in the news shedding crocodile tears, was beginning to arouse suspicions he could no longer ignore. "Dr. Michael, please, this time you need to listen to me." Emma's voice trembled slightly, but her eyes held an iron determination as she opened her colorful folder on the cluttered table. "I have proof that my mom is innocent, and now I know why Mr. Whitmore was killed." Her small hands methodically spread out the evidence, the drawing from the night of the dinner, the printed photo from the cell phone showing Catherine at the drinks table, and finally, the sealed envelope that Robert had entrusted to Mrs. Eleanor. Michael adjusted his reading glasses and, for the first time, really looked at what the girl was showing. His eyes widened as he recognized the patterns of bank transfers and documents proving the corruption scheme. "This is much bigger than we imagined," Michael muttered, running his hands through his graying hair as he absorbed the magnitude of the evidence. The lawyer stood up, beginning to pace the cramped office as he mentally connected the pieces of the puzzle. Robert's disappearance, the rush to convict his mother, the Sinclair family's influence. It all fits. He stopped in front of Emma, who watched him with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "You're a very brave girl, you know, and I was a fool for not listening to you sooner." His voice carried the weight of regret, but also a new determination that made Emma's eyes shine. Michael returned to his desk, taking a notepad in his steady but slightly trembling hands, and began to write furiously, his thoughts organizing as swiftly as his handwriting filled the pages. The rhythmic sound of the pen scratching against the paper filled the charged silence of the office, keeping time with the ticking of the wall clock that marked the relentless passage of time. "We'll need to act with extreme caution," he explained, without raising his eyes, his professional tone laced with a palpable urgency. The lamp on the desk cast severe shadows over his weary face, accentuating the concern that weighed upon him. He paused from writing for a moment and massaged his temples, reflecting on the gravity of the situation. Catherine Sinclair has powerful connections, and what happened to Robert proves they won't hesitate to silence anyone who threatens to expose the truth. Lady Eleanor, seated beside Emma, crossed her arms with a sigh, her eyes carrying a mixture of fear and determination. "So, what exactly can we do? We're running against time, and they know it." Michael set down his pen, leaning forward, resting his forearms on the table. His gaze met Emma's, and for a moment, his hardened expression softened. "But I promise you I won't rest until your mother is free," he said, his voice firm as an unbreakable vow. "Some battles need to be fought, no matter the cost, and this is one we cannot lose." Emma clenched her fists on her lap, feeling for the first time in weeks a true hope growing in her chest. At last, she had found an ally who not only believed her, but had the means and determination to help her fight against the injustice. And now she knew. This war was far from over, but this time they would not fight alone. Michael's office was bathed in the golden light of dusk as he and Emma meticulously examined Mary's old phone. The lawyer had procured a new charger, and now his skilled hands navigated through folders and files, searching for any detail that might have gone unnoticed. Emma watched the screen intently, her observant eyes missing not a single movement, when something caught her attention. "Wait!" she exclaimed, pointing to an almost hidden icon. "Mom always saved a backup of my photos in that special folder, just in case I accidentally deleted them." Michael clicked on the icon, revealing a password-protected folder. "Do you know what the password might be, Emma?" Michael asked, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The girl closed her eyes for a moment, concentrating on her memories. "Mom always used my birth date and hers together," she replied, reciting the numbers that Michael swiftly typed in. The folder opened, revealing dozens of automatic backups, and there it was, a second copy of the incriminating photo, with even better quality than the original. The image clearly showed the mirror reflection, Catherine slipping the powder into the drink, every detail sharp as a scream of truth. The file even had the metadata intact, proving the exact date and time the photo was taken. The satisfaction of the discovery, however, was short-lived. The office phone rang, its shrill ring cutting through the moment of triumph. Michael answered, his face gradually paling as he listened. "What do you mean the trial was moved up?" His voice betrayed a mixture of disbelief and anger. "That's completely irregular. We need time to prepare the defense." He paused, listening further before abruptly hanging up. Emma could see the gears turning in the lawyer's mind as he furiously typed into his computer, accessing the court system. There it was, the official notification. Mary's trial had been rescheduled for just 2 days away. "Catherine must have found out about the evidence," Michael muttered. His brow creased with worry as his hands gripped the arms of his office chair tightly. The pale glow of the monitor reflected off his glasses, highlighting the tension lines that deepened with every passing second. "She's using her husband's influence to rush the process before we can properly present the evidence." His voice carried a tone of frustration mixed with urgency, as if each word were a domino piece teetering on the edge of collapse. Emma, seated beside Lady Eleanor, watched the lawyer's expression with keen eyes, catching nuances of fear he might have tried to hide. The atmosphere in the office was charged, stifled by the weight of uncertainties. The old fan in the corner spun lazily, unable to alleviate the suffocating sensation that had settled in the room. As Michael spoke, a sharp notification sound echoed through the space. He whipped around to the computer screen, where a new window had opened, an anonymous email with an attachment. His heart raced as he clicked on the message, and then the image materialized before his eyes. Donald Parker, visibly battered, his face covered in bruises and a deep cut above his brow, holding a newspaper from the current day. Silence fell upon the office like an invisible weight. The message was clear. They still had power and they wouldn't hesitate to use it. Emma felt a cold chill run down her spine as she averted her gaze to the television in the corner of the room. On the screen, Catherine smiled with an unsettling perfection during a live interview, her silky voice conveying a false serenity. "Justice will finally be served," she declared, her eyes gleaming with a rehearsed triumph. But Emma knew. Behind that calculated smile, something far more sinister lurked. Time was running out and Catherine still had one more card up her sleeve. The sun had already set when a black car with tinted windows silently parked near the school where Emma studied. Catherine, sitting in the back seat, watched through the smoky glass as she adjusted her Italian leather gloves. Her face, normally a perfect mask of elegance, now displayed a calculating coldness that matched the metallic glint of the small pistol resting in her designer purse. By her side, two men in dark suits awaited her instructions, their hard stares fixed on the school's exit where the last children were still waiting for their parents. Catherine had discovered that Emma usually waited for Mrs. Eleanor at that spot every afternoon, and today the meddlesome neighbor was conveniently stuck in an unexpected traffic jam on the other side of town. "Remember, I want it to look like a common kidnapping." Catherine's voice flowed like poisoned honey as she instructed her henchmen. "No visible marks, nothing that can be traced back to us. The girl simply needs to disappear until after the trial." Her long, elegant fingers tapped softly on the leather seat as she watched Emma through the glass, alone on the school steps, her school uniform and colorful backpack making her seem even smaller and more vulnerable. The irony was not lost on Catherine. This same child, with her innocence and amateur photos, had become the greatest threat to her carefully constructed empire. "It's almost poetic," she thought, a cruel smile playing on her perfectly painted lips, "that the maid's daughter is the only one capable of unmasking the mistress." The plan was meticulously architected. Her men would approach Emma when she started walking towards the corner where she usually met Mrs. Eleanor. The dark van was already strategically positioned in the side alley, ready to disappear into the shadows of the city with its little prisoner. Catherine had even prepared a moving story for the cameras, her false tears already rehearsed, as she would lament the terrible kidnapping of the daughter of the woman she had tried so hard to help. The right moment was crucial. In less than 48 hours, Mary would be tried and condemned, and without Emma's testimony or the evidence the girl held, nothing could prevent Catherine from completing her perfect revenge. Emma remained oblivious to the danger lurking, her little fingers busy drawing in her notebook as she waited. Catherine watched with morbid interest as the girl held the drawing up to the light of the street lamp that was just beginning to turn on. It was a portrait of her, Catherine, but not the public version everyone knew. Somehow that child had captured in her childish strokes the true essence of the woman who planned her kidnapping. Eyes as cold as jade, a smile that seemed more like a cruel slit in her perfectly made-up face. "Impressive," murmured Catherine, an involuntary shiver running down her spine at seeing her true nature exposed through the eyes of a child. It was one more reason to ensure Emma was silenced. That little artist saw too much, understood too much. "It's time," declared Catherine, her eyes as sharp as blades, following the movement across the street. Her voice came out low, controlled, laden with a surgical coldness that made each word seem like a definitive command. She watched from her back seat, her gloved fingers trailing idly over the soft leather of the designer purse on her lap, as if she were merely waiting for a waiter to bring her drink at an elegant restaurant. But this was no trivial moment. It was the final piece of a meticulously architected game. Mrs. Eleanor, across the sidewalk, fiddled with her cell phone, hastily sending a message to Emma. The glow of the screen reflected on her worried face as her fingers rapidly typed, informing the girl of her unexpected delay. The night traffic was heavy in that part of the city, the headlights of cars creating shimmering beams of light that crisscrossed the avenue in irregular patterns. Emma, sitting on the school steps, received the message and sighed, closing her notebook and carefully putting it in her backpack. Her little fingers adjusted the straps on her shoulders, and with the innocence of a well-brought-up child, smoothed her school uniform before standing up. An automatic habit, a routine gesture, but for Catherine, every second the girl spent unaware of the danger only fueled her perverse satisfaction. "Bring her to me and make sure no one sees anything," Catherine ordered with a discreet wave. The men silently exited the car, their steps absorbed by the asphalt, their shadows stretching like dark claws on the dimly lit ground. Catherine leaned back in the back seat, an almost imperceptible smile playing at the corner of her lips. The last obstacle was about to disappear. Soon no one would ever question what happened that night, not even the little artist who dared to defy her. Mrs. Eleanor had never driven so fast in her entire life. The taxi that had brought her there had gotten stuck in the suspicious traffic jam, but something in her sixth sense made her get out and run the last 3 blocks to the school. Her years working as a secretary in law offices had taught her to recognize suspicious patterns, and that sudden gridlock, precisely the day before the trial, set off all her internal alarms. Now breathless and with her heart pounding erratically, she rounded the last corner, in time to see 2 suited men stealthily approaching Emma, who was putting her sketchbook in her backpack, completely unaware of the danger. "Emma, run! Mrs." Eleanor's shout echoed, making the girl freeze before turning around. The men, realizing they had lost the element of surprise, tried to reach her. The first one was already extending his hand when Mrs. Eleanor, gathering all her courage, quickly crossed the street and placed herself between them and the girl. "Don't touch her." Her firm voice made the men hesitate for a second, long enough for her to pull Emma and flee down the busy street. The black car across the street started its engine, and Emma could see Catherine's tense expression. Mrs. Eleanor pulled the girl into a commercial gallery, their footsteps echoing down the hallway. Knowing the neighborhood well, she guided Emma through strategic shortcuts and corridors. "Hold my hand tight, dear," she instructed as they followed a safe path. Adrenaline coursed through Mrs. Eleanor's veins as she led Emma through a labyrinth of alleys and narrow passages. Her legs were already protesting from the unusual exertion, but the fear of what could happen to the girl kept her moving. Emma, for her part, gripped her neighbor's hand tightly, her little lungs burning from the effort of fleeing. They emerged onto a busy street, where Mrs. Eleanor quickly spotted a bus about to depart. With one last effort, the 2 ran to the vehicle, boarding seconds before the doors closed. Through the window, they saw the black car whizzing by, its occupants clearly frustrated at having lost their prey. "We need to go somewhere safe," whispered Mrs. Eleanor, still trying to catch her breath as she protectively embraced Emma. The lady's heart was still pounding in her chest, and her vision took a moment to adjust to the frantic pace of the last few minutes. Emma trembled in her arms, her little body still vulnerable to the impact of the real danger that had almost engulfed her. The girl squeezed her eyes shut, as if she wanted to push away the images of the men in black trying to reach her, the rough hands coming closer to drag her to an unknown fate. "Catherine will try again, won't she?" Emma's question, though whispered, echoed like a sentence inside the nearly empty bus. Her small but surprisingly firm voice betrayed that the girl understood the gravity of the situation better than anyone would like to admit. She was no ordinary child. She had been forced to mature quickly, to understand that the truth alone was not enough when facing people as powerful as Catherine Sinclair. Lady Eleanor nodded gravely, running her hand through the girl's sweat-damp hair, feeling the weight of fear mixed with determination in every strand. Her mind was already working on a plan, every possibility spinning like gears of an antique clock. She could not fail. Suddenly, the cell phone vibrated inside the bag, the muffled but unmistakable sound bringing a glimmer of hope. With trembling hands, the lady picked up the device and read the message from Attorney Michael. He had secured a safe place for them to hide until the trial. As the bus wound through the dark city streets, moving them away from immediate danger, Lady Eleanor glanced at Emma and then up at the sky outside. Silently, she prayed they could keep the girl safe long enough Today's battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Judge Charles Sinclair's chambers were shrouded in the dusk as he reread the case file against Mary for the 100th time. Something troubled him deeply. Small inconsistencies that had once seemed insignificant now screamed at his conscience like alarms impossible to ignore. The toxicology report mentioned a specific substance, rare and difficult to obtain, that would be unlikely to be within reach of a cook. Moreover, the disappearance of investigative journalist Donald Parker, just as he began investigating the case, was too disturbing a coincidence to be ignored. Charles removed his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes, feeling the weight of his doubts grow with each new rereading of the case. Catherine's behavior was also beginning to arouse suspicions he was desperately trying to suppress. Her tears in the testimonies seemed too rehearsed, her reactions calculated with an almost cinematic precision. The night before, he had found her in his private office, furtively rummaging through his case folder, something she had never done in 20 years of marriage. When questioned, Catherine deflected with a skillfulness that now seemed more manipulative than charming. "Dear, I was just organizing your things," she had said, but her green eyes had avoided his in a way that deeply disturbed him. The mysterious calls she received, the sudden meetings she had to attend, it all began to form a sinister pattern he could no longer ignore. An anonymous envelope had arrived on his desk that morning, containing records of suspicious bank transfers between companies linked to Catherine and Whitmore. Charles felt his world crumbling as he recognized his wife's digital signature on documents that suggested a far more complex relationship between her and the victim than simply employer and client. The dates coincided with periods when Catherine said she was on business trips, and the amounts moved were too astronomical to be explained by legitimate transactions. His heart as a husband wanted to deny it, but his mind as a judge could not ignore the mounting evidence. The door to his chambers opened softly, and Catherine entered like a vision in her immaculate dress, her expensive perfume preceding her like a herald of her presence. The television cameras were already positioned in the courthouse hallway, ready for the big day of the trial. "Charles, darling, we need to talk about tomorrow." Her melodious voice carried that tone he now recognized as her most effective weapon. Catherine approached his desk, tears already starting to form in her perfectly made-up eyes. "That woman must pay for what she did. Whitmore was our friend, remember? He dined at our house, trusted us." Each word was like a dagger twisting in Charles's chest, as he now saw double meanings in everything she said. Catherine's tears began to fall, sliding slowly down her impeccably made-up face, reflecting the warm light of the chamber like little liquid jewels. Each drop was strategically calculated, each sob subtly measured to hit the precise point between vulnerability and manipulation. She tilted her head slightly to the side, allowing her perfectly aligned bangs to partially cover her eyes, making the scene even more dramatic for the cameras that would certainly capture her emotional exit. "You won't disappoint me tomorrow, will you, dear?" Her voice came out low, trembling at the exact measure between plea and threat, laden with a melancholic tone that could move anyone who didn't know the truth behind her performance. Her well-manicured hands slid smoothly across the mahogany desk, her nude, polished fingers lightly touching the documents Charles had in front of him, as if her touch could influence him to make the decision she wanted. "You've always been a fair man, Charles, a man who knows what's best for his family," she continued, her tone oscillating between sweet and venomous. "It would be a scandal if people knew you hesitated to do the right thing." Charles observed his wife in silence, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. For the first time, he saw Catherine's perfect mask beginning to show cracks. The glint in her eyes, the one that had once captivated him, now seemed cold, almost cruel. The weight of the robe had never felt as crushing as it did at that moment. His breathing grew heavy as his conscience struggled between moral duty and fear of consequences. Would he have the courage to do what was right, even if it meant destroying his marriage, and perhaps his own career? The courtroom was packed that morning, the murmur of conversations filling the air like a restless swarm. Mary, seated in the defendant's bench in her orange prison uniform, seemed to have aged decades in the last few months. Her hands, once steady and skilled in the kitchen, now trembled slightly as she watched the jurors take their seats. The face that had once always carried a gentle smile was marked by deep circles and a pallor that revealed sleepless nights in prison. More painful than the marks of the blows she had received in the penitentiary was the void she felt in her chest. Emma was nowhere to be seen, and no one told her where her daughter was. The fear for her little artist's fate consumed her thoughts more than her own impending sentence. Catherine occupied a place in the front row, her elegant figure a study in false dignity and rehearsed suffering. Her impeccable black tailleur and soft makeup conveyed precisely the image she wanted to project, that of a betrayed patron mourning the loss of a close friend. The television cameras, exceptionally authorized to broadcast the trial live, captured every calculated sigh, every carefully timed tear she let slip. Judge Charles, seated on his elevated bench, kept an unreadable expression as he flipped through the documents before him, deliberately avoiding eye contact with both his wife and the defendant. The atmosphere carried a palpable tension, as if the very air was electrified with the anticipation of what was to come. "All rise for the start of the session," announced the court officer, his voice echoing through the chamber as everyone stood up. Mary felt her legs weaken as she rose to her feet, the weight of the handcuffs on her wrists seeming to increase with every passing second. The prosecutor, a severe-looking man who clearly already considered her guilty, organized his notes with a confidence that made her stomach churn. Her public defender seemed uncomfortable and unprepared, nervously shuffling through his thin folder, containing a defense they both knew was inadequate. Through the high courthouse windows, rays of sunlight pierced the heavy air, creating shafts of light that seemed like natural spotlights on the drama about to unfold. Judge Charles began the proceedings with a firm voice, but Mary noticed a slight hesitation in his gaze as he spoke her name. "The State versus Mary Dawson, charged with the first-degree murder of Robert Whitmore by poisoning." His words fell heavy in the silence of the room. Mary closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the last time she saw Emma, her brave little girl trying to reach her as she was led away by the police. The longing and worry for her daughter were like knives twisting in her chest, making her question if she still had the strength to face what was to come. The prosecutor rose, adjusting his tie as he prepared for his opening statement, his eyes gleaming with the certainty of an imminent victory. "Your Honor," began the prosecutor, his steady, calculated voice resonating through the courtroom like an invisible hammer strike. He adjusted his tie in a slow, deliberate motion, savoring the expectation building in the chamber. "Today we will present irrefutable evidence that the defendant, abusing the trust placed in her, premeditatedly poisoned Robert Whitmore during a dinner at the Sinclair residence." His words echoed with an almost theatrical weight, filling every corner of the room as if there was no longer space for doubt. Mary felt a chill run down her spine. Her body shrank slightly under the weight of the words that seemed like an anticipated verdict. Silent tears streamed down her face, hot and treacherous, as she looked at the jurors. Each of them wore a closed, impassive expression, but Mary recognized the subtle signs betraying the decision they had already made before hearing any evidence. The slight furrowing of a gentleman's brow in the third row, the way one of the jurors pursed her lips as if already decided. Her fate seemed sealed. In the back of the room, journalists filled their notepads with an unsettling voracity. Pens scratched paper at a frantic pace, capturing every syllable as if predators dissecting prey. Camera flashes cut through the environment in bursts of light that reflected off the polished floor, turning the scene into a public spectacle of humiliation. Catherine, seated in the front row, exhibited the posture of an inconsolable widow. Her hands were delicately clasped in her lap, the black mourning dress perfectly aligned, her eyes downcast as if still in mourning. But Mary saw it. For a brief moment, when their gazes met, a cruel glint flickered in the woman's green eyes. A faint smile threatened to curve the corner of her mouth. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And in that moment, Mary knew Catherine was savoring every second of her downfall. Judge Charles adjusted his robe, bracing himself to deliver the sentence that weighed on his conscience like lead. The courtroom was enveloped in a sepulchral silence, broken only by the occasional camera flash documenting every moment of the trial. Mary kept her eyes downcast, her silent tears marking small dark stains on her prison uniform, while Catherine displayed a discreet smile of anticipated triumph. The air felt heavy, laden with the weight of the injustice about to be consummated, when suddenly the double doors of the courtroom burst open with a crash that made everyone jump. Emma burst through the central aisle like a small hurricane of determination, her hair disheveled from running and her school uniform still dirty from the previous day's escape. In her small, trembling hands, she clutched a brown envelope and her old cell phone. Mrs. Eleanor followed close behind, trying to catch up, while Attorney Michael rushed in with a folder of documents. "My mom is innocent." Emma's scream echoed off the courtroom walls, her childish voice carrying a strength that froze everyone in their tracks. Mary jerked her head up at the sound of her daughter's voice, a sob escaping her lips as she saw her little girl after so long apart. Catherine leapt to her feet, her elegant face contorting into an expression of barely contained fury. "Order! Order in the court!" Judge Charles's voice thundered over the commotion that had arisen, but Emma was already running towards the judge's bench, her hands outstretched with the evidence she carried. "Uncle Charles, please, look." Aunt Catherine lied. Her words made the entire courtroom hold its breath. Emma, ignoring the protests of the court officers trying to restrain her, connected her phone to a projector being used for evidence presentation. The photo she had taken that fateful night appeared on the wall, enlarged and clear as a cry of truth. Catherine reflected in the mirror, pouring something into Whitmore's drink. The courtroom erupted in exclamations of surprise and shock as Catherine rose to her feet, her face pale as wax. "This is an absurdity, a frame-up. How can they allow a child to interrupt a trial like this?" Catherine's voice trembled with a note of panic that had never been heard in her ever-controlled tone. But Emma was not finished. With trembling but resolute hands, she opened the envelope that Robert had entrusted to Mrs. Eleanor before disappearing. "The journalist Robert found out everything." Her childish voice carried a maturity beyond her years as she handed the documents to the judge. Aunt Catherine and Uncle Whitmore were stealing money together, but he wanted to tell the truth, so she... Emma didn't need to finish the sentence. The documents in her hands spoke for themselves. Judge Charles examined the evidence with trembling hands, his dilated pupils absorbing every line of the documents he held. The room seemed to shrink around him as he processed the magnitude of what he saw. Familiar signatures stared back at him like ghosts of a past he could no longer ignore. Strategically manipulated dates, exorbitant amounts transferred to suspicious accounts. It was all there, irrefutable, like a silent verdict condemning him for years of willful blindness. The paper felt like lead in his hands. The television cameras captured every moment of the unfolding drama. The sound of camera clicks mingled with the growing murmur of the audience, who began to sense the unexpected turn of events. The focus alternated between Emma's determined face, holding her drawing like a trophy of truth, and Mary's tears, flowing freely in a mixture of relief and disbelief. Catherine, who until then had maintained her impeccable poise, now displayed the first real crack in her facade of absolute control. Her eyes frantically scanned the courtroom as if desperately searching for an invisible escape. "This can't. You can't," she muttered, her voice broken by rapid breaths as if the air had suddenly become scarce. The once confident and relentless prosecutor flipped through the documents with trembling fingers, his expression of shock turning into utter disbelief. He spun his head toward the judge, then to the jury as if seeking some confirmation that this was real. His own accusation began to crumble, and now it was he who needed to find words to justify what seemed to be the greatest judicial sham in years. Judge Charles felt the world spinning as his eyes traced every detail of the photograph projected on the courtroom wall. There was his wife, Catherine, her face partially reflected in the decorative mirror of the dining room, her elegant fingers clearly pouring something into Whitmore's glass. The image was too clear, too specific to be forged. His hands trembled as he held the documents Emma had delivered, bank statements, suspicious contracts, incriminating emails, all forming a web of evidence he could no longer ignore. 20 years of marriage crumbled before his eyes like a house of cards, struck by a merciless gust of wind. "Catherine." His voice came out as a hoarse whisper, laden with 2 decades of betrayed trust. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the judge slowly rose from his chair, his eyes finally meeting those of his wife. Where he once saw love and devotion, he now saw only calculation and manipulation. The tears she had shed, the impassioned arguments for Mary's conviction, even her morning kisses goodbye, it had all been an elaborate theatrical performance. The weight of this realization made his knees buckle, and he had to lean on his desk to remain standing. "You used me, used my position, my trust, to condemn an innocent." Catherine, realizing her mask of perfection had finally slipped, allowed her face to assume an expression of contempt that shocked everyone present. "You were always so easily manipulated, Charles." Her voice cut through the air like a poisoned blade. "So concerned with keeping up appearances, so eager to believe your own lies about our perfect marriage." She rose, still maintaining her elegant posture even as her world crumbled. The television cameras captured every moment, broadcasting live the transformation of the respected socialite into an unmasked criminal. The prosecutor, who minutes before had fervently argued for Mary's guilt, now frantically leafed through the documents, his expression shifting from shock to determination. Emma ran to embrace her openly weeping mother in the defendant's box, while Mrs. Eleanor and Attorney Michael approached with more evidence in hand. "Your Honor," the prosecutor's voice cut through the murmurs engulfing the courtroom, "in light of the new evidence presented, the prosecution immediately withdraws all charges against Mary Dawson." He paused dramatically, adjusting his tie before continuing. "Furthermore, I request the preventive arrest of Catherine Sinclair for the crimes of aggravated homicide, financial fraud, and attempted obstruction of justice. We have reason to believe she is also involved in the disappearance of journalist Donald Parker." Chaos erupted in the courtroom as two police officers began to approach Catherine. The murmur swelled in waves like a roiling sea of shock and disbelief. Reporters jostled to capture the scene better, while camera flashes exploded like lightning, illuminating Catherine's face from brutal angles, capturing every nuance of her uncontrolled fury. Jurors exchanged alarmed looks, some raising their hands to their mouths in disbelief. In the public benches, nervous whispers spread rapidly, creating a cacophony of muffled murmurs and indignant exclamations. Catherine stepped back, her heels clicking on the marble floor, her hands trembling slightly. Her green eyes, once so controlled and seductive, now blazed with a wild fury, as if still refusing to accept defeat. She took a deep breath, her expression oscillating between contempt and a desperate need to justify herself. "You don't understand," she hissed, her voice cutting, laced with venom. "Whitmore was going to destroy everything, reveal our business, ruin years of careful work. He had to be eliminated, and that meddling maid was the perfect excuse." The words slipped from her lips before she could contain them, resonating through the courtroom like thunder. The ensuing silence was overwhelming. Every word had been captured by the microphones positioned around the room, broadcast live to millions of viewers. The impact of the confession reverberated through the chamber like a seismic wave, eliciting shocked gasps and causing reporters to redouble the intensity of their note-taking. Judge Charles, who still seemed to be trying to comprehend the weight of what he had heard, straightened in his chair. His face was pale, but his expression hardened. Regaining his professional composure, he raised the gavel and struck it forcefully, the sound echoing like a final blow upon Catherine's fate. The chaos that ensued in the courtroom after Catherine's confession created the distraction she was hoping for. With the agility of a cornered snake, she violently pushed away the two officers approaching her and ran towards the emergency exit. Her expensive heels struck the marble floor like frantic drums as she knocked over chairs and people in her path. Judge Charles, still stunned by the revelation of his wife's true nature, watched the scene as if trapped in a nightmare from which he could not awaken. "You really thought you'd catch me that easily?" Her voice echoed coldly through the courtroom. "Whitmore was just a pawn on the board. There are many more people involved in this." The cameras captured every word as Catherine moved tensely. She reached into her purse, causing an uproar in the courtroom. Everyone stepped back, fearing her intentions. Emma hugged Mary Dawson tightly, while Lady Eleanor protectively stood in front of the two. The lawyer Michael, displaying unexpected courage, tried to block Catherine's path, but she shoved him aside with a violent swing of her purse. "Do you know what's most pathetic, Charles?" She screamed at her husband, her smile now a twisted mask of cruelty. "How ridiculously easy it was to manipulate you all these years. The great upright judge, so concerned with his reputation that he couldn't see the truth right under his nose." Her words were poisoned darts, each one hitting Charles like a physical stab. Catherine's escape, however, was shorter-lived than she'd hoped. Her high heels clacked against the polished marble of the courtroom as she pushed chairs and bumped into people, trying to figure out what was happening. The frantic murmur of the crowd filled the air, voices blending into shocked exclamations and whispered questions. Television cameras quickly adjusted to capture her desperate attempt to escape, while reporters murmured among themselves about the trial's unexpected twist. As she passed through the courtroom's double doors, a cold wind hit her face. But what made her freeze wasn't the temperature, but the sight that awaited her outside. There, ascending the courthouse's imposing steps, was a team of federal agents, their badges gleaming in the late afternoon light. But what truly took Catherine's breath away was the figure striding at the front of the troop, Donald Parker, battered but alive, every bruise on his face telling the story of his captivity and survival. The journalist stopped a few meters from her, tilting his head slightly, his eyes boring into Catherine's like sharp blades. "It's over, Catherine," he said, his voice ringing firm despite being weighed down by exhaustion and pain. He held up a thick envelope he gripped tightly. "We found all the evidence in your hideout, all the documents, all the recordings. Whitmore wasn't your only victim, was he?" Catherine looked frantically around like a caged animal, her green eyes scanning the crowd for an escape. But there was no way out. The noose had tightened. The empire of lies she had built, piece by piece, was about to crumble beneath her feet. Surrounded by federal agents, with Donald Parker as a living witness to her crimes, Catherine still held a last shred of hope in her gaze as she turned to Charles. Her green eyes, which for so many years had manipulated and seduced, now silently pleaded with her husband for an intervention, one final display of the power he had always wielded as a respected judge. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, watching the final drama unfold between the couple who had once embodied high society's elite. The gun in her hand trembled slightly, betraying the first real crack in her facade of total control. Charles rose slowly from his chair, his shoulders bearing the weight of 20 years of exposed lies. His gaze swept the courtroom, from Catherine's trembling figure to the determined faces of the federal agents, from Mary Dawson's relieved smile to the glint of justice in Emma's eyes. Finally, his eyes settled on the evidence scattered across his desk, the photos, the documents, the irrefutable proof of a lifetime of crimes and manipulations. "Drop the gun, Catherine." His voice rang firm and devoid of the adoration it had once carried when saying her name. "It's over. There's no one left here for you to manipulate." Catherine's last mask began to crumble at her husband's firm words. Her knees buckled, and the gun fell from her fingers with a metallic thud that echoed through the silent courtroom. The agents quickly subdued her, and the sound of handcuffs snapping shut around her delicate wrists seemed to rouse Charles from a 2-decade trance. He resumed his seat behind the judge's bench, his posture regaining the dignity the position demanded. "Catherine Sinclair," his voice now carried the formal weight of the law, "you are under arrest for the premeditated murder of Robert Whitmore, attempted murder of Donald Parker, conspiracy, financial fraud, and obstruction of justice." The prosecutor, Mark Ellison, advanced slowly across the courtroom's hardwood floor, his cautious steps echoing in the heavy silence that hung over the chamber. The folder of documents he carried seemed to weigh tons, not from its physical heft, but from the density of the revelations it contained. His hands, slightly trembling, arranged the documents on the polished oak table, creating a mosaic of papers that represented years of secret investigations. "Your Honor," his voice rang out clear and controlled, "what we have here is not just a case of murder, but the exposure of a criminal network that extends far beyond what we initially imagined." Charles Sinclair adjusted his glasses, his fingers methodically leafing through the pages, each movement revealing an almost surgical concentration. Small details leapt out at his eyes. Suspicious bank transfers, appointments scheduled at discrete locations, coded communications that formed a complex puzzle of systemic corruption. "It's unbelievable," he muttered to himself, "how they managed to keep this hidden for so long." The prosecutor cleared his throat, calling the attention of those present. "We have discovered links with at least 3 shell companies, misappropriation of public funds totaling more than 5 million reais, and a money laundering scheme involving high-ranking politicians." Catherine, sitting nearby, maintained an impassive expression, but a muscle in her temple pulsed discreetly, betraying her inner tension. Charles raised his eyes, his gaze sweeping the courtroom with renewed authority. He was no longer the manipulated judge, but a man determined to expose the truth, no matter the personal consequences. "Considering the gravity of the proven crimes," his voice thundered through the room, and the clear premeditation in each of them, I sentenced the defendant to the maximum penalty provided by law. The gavel struck with a symbolic force, echoing like an omen of justice finally achieved. Catherine, once the embodiment of power and manipulation, now seemed shrunken, a pale shadow of her former persona. Her eyes, once seductive and calculating, sought Charles's in a final flicker of hope. But they found only an unwavering determination, a face transformed by the newly discovered truth. The words of supplication died on her lips before they were even uttered. Judge Charles took a deep breath, his gaze now turned to Mary Dawson, who remained in the dock with a silent dignity that contrasted sharply with Catherine's earlier loss of control. The courtroom, still recovering from the shock of the revelations and the arrest of the judge's wife, awaited in respectful silence. Emma, holding Lady Eleanor's hand firmly, had her eyes fixed on her mother, decades of love and hope condensed into that single moment. Mary's face, marked by the months of unjust suffering in prison, began to light up with the first spark of true hope since this whole nightmare had begun. "Stand to hear the sentence," announced the court officer, his voice echoing through the chamber. Mary stood up, her legs trembling slightly under the weight of emotion. Charles adjusted his robe and, for the first time since the trial began, allowed a gentle smile to soften his features. "Mrs. Mary Dawson, in light of the evidence presented and the confession of the true culprit, I declare you innocent of all charges. You are free." The sound of the gavel striking echoed like music through the courthouse corridors, and before the echo had even dissipated, Emma had already run into her mother's arms, knocking over her sketchbook in the process, from which spilled all the colors of the world she had kept during the months of separation. It was at this moment of celebration that Catherine, still handcuffed and being led out of the courtroom by the police officers, managed to break free from the grip of the agents for a moment. Her body twisted like a snake about to strike, and her eyes met Emma's with an intensity that made the girl freeze in the middle of her embrace with her mother. "This is not over yet," Catherine's whisper cut through the air like a poisoned blade, her lips curving into a smile that promised revenge. "You have no idea of the power I still have, even behind bars." The officers quickly pulled her away, but the venom of her words had already been released, hovering in the air like a dark cloud over the moment of joy. Mary hugged Emma even tighter in her arms, as if she could protect her from Catherine's veiled threat with her maternal love alone. The courtroom, with its noble wooden walls and tall windows, seemed to echo Catherine's final threatening words, despite the murmur of people beginning to disperse around them. Donald Parker, still bearing the bruises of his captivity visible under the golden light streaming through the courthouse's stained glass windows, approached with a determined expression. His crumpled suit and loose tie bore evidence of the days of captivity, but his eyes shone with the same journalistic determination as ever. "Don't worry," he assured them, his voice carrying the firmness of one who had survived the worst. He adjusted the bandage on his wrist, a mark of the ropes that had bound him, and continued, "The federal investigation continues, and we're going to dismantle every piece of the criminal empire she built. I have an entire team of investigative journalists working on this right now." Lady Eleanor, still holding the envelope with the evidence firmly, and Lawyer Michael, with his briefcase tucked under his arm, joined the group, forming a protective circle around mother and daughter. The sound of their shoes on the marble floor echoed through the space as they approached, like the steps of guardians. But even surrounded by allies and finally free, Mary could not completely ignore the murderous glint she had seen in Catherine's eyes, a somber reminder that some battles, even won, leave scars that take time to heal. Her fingers unconsciously caressed Emma's hair, while her eyes remained fixed on the door through which Catherine had been taken, as if expecting that threat to return at any moment. The steps of the courthouse seemed infinitely lighter, as Mary Dawson descended them with Emma in her arms, the afternoon sun bathing mother and daughter in a golden embrace that seemed to want to make up for all the months of separation. The tears streaming down their faces were no longer of pain or fear, but crystals of pure joy that reflected the daylight like tiny diamonds of happiness. Emma buried her face in her mother's neck, breathing in deeply that familiar scent her drawings had failed to capture, a mixture of vanilla, love, and fulfilled promises that meant, finally, being home. "Mom, I knew I could bring you back," Emma whispered. Her voice choked with emotion as her little hands clung to the prison uniform her mother still wore, as if fearing she might disappear again. Mary tightened the embrace even more, feeling her little warrior's heart beating against her own in a perfect rhythm of reunion. Her hands, which for so long had been bound and idle, could now finally do what they most longed for: caress her daughter's hair, wipe away her tears, convey through touch all the love that words could never fully express. The world around them seemed to have momentarily disappeared, the reporters with their cameras, the onlookers crowding the steps, even their friends watching the scene with emotional smiles. Everything had dissolved in that sacred moment of reconnection. The noise of the city around the courthouse had become a distant murmur, as if the universe itself respected that moment between mother and daughter. "My brave little artist," Mary murmured through tears of joy, her trembling fingers caressing Emma's face, feeling every detail the memory of prison had tried to erase. She pulled back just enough to look into Emma's eyes, those same eyes that had captured the truth in her drawings and photos when no one else could see it. The prison uniform she still wore contrasted with the tenderness of the moment, but even that coarse fabric couldn't diminish the softness of her maternal touch. "You never gave up. You never stopped fighting. You are the true hero of this story," Mary continued, her voice choked with emotion. "When I was in there, it was your drawings that kept me strong." Emma smiled through her tears, that pure and luminous smile that Mary feared she would never see again. Her small hands, which for months had transformed pain into art, now trembled slightly as she opened her worn backpack, the same one that had accompanied her on every visit to the prison. From inside it, she took out a new drawing, a colorful work depicting the two of them together, free under a sky without bars or shadows. The paper was still warm from the sun that streamed through the windows of the school where she had finished it that morning, hopeful for the verdict that would change their lives. The afternoon sun was beginning to set as Judge Charles Sinclair descended the steps of the forum, no longer wearing his robe, but a simple suit that seemed to weigh tons on his hunched shoulders. The television cameras and reporters who still remained immediately turned towards him, but there was something different about his demeanor. The haughtiness of his position had given way to a genuine humility that completely transformed his figure. His eyes, marked by deep circles that evidenced sleepless nights and self-criticism, sought out Mary Dawson's face as she still embraced Emma on the lower steps of the staircase. "Mrs. Mary," his voice caught as he pronounced her name, and he needed to pause to regain his composure. "No apology will be enough to compensate for the suffering I caused you and your daughter through my blindness and arrogance. I allowed my pride, my position, and my misplaced trust in Catherine to prevent me from seeing the truth that was before my eyes." The words came out like a painful but necessary confession, each one carrying the weight of months of injustice. The reporters' microphones captured every syllable, broadcasting live the moment when one of the city's most respected judges publicly acknowledged his mistakes. Charles descended a few more steps, his imposing figure now bent by the weight of conscience. The cold marble of the forum's steps echoed with every footfall, a sonorous reminder of his journey towards redemption. Reporters whispered among themselves, their cameras clicking incessantly, capturing every nuance of this historic moment. The wind rustled the leaves of the century-old trees lining the staircase, creating a soft music that seemed to cradle this moment of transformation. Stopping at a respectful distance from Mary and Emma, his hands visibly shook as he withdrew an official envelope from his pocket, the cream-colored paper contrasting with the dark hue of his suit. "I've spent a great deal of time reflecting on my actions," he began, his voice hoarse with emotion, "on how I allowed my own arrogance to blind my judgment. Therefore," he continued, straightening his shoulders as if bracing to carry a new kind of responsibility, "I not only ask for forgiveness, but also announce my immediate resignation from the position of judge. I can no longer occupy a role that demands discernment and impartiality after having failed so gravely in upholding those principles." A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. Charles raised his eyes to the imposing edifice of the forum behind him, where he had spent so many years believing he was serving justice. "You know, Emma," he said, turning to the girl with a sad smile, "in all my years of studying and practicing law, I never learned the most important lesson that you taught me, that the truth doesn't need titles or robes to be heard." His voice gained strength as he continued, as if each word liberated him from an invisible weight. An 8-year-old child demonstrated more wisdom and courage in the pursuit of justice than I did in all my years on the bench. This will be my final official act, to personally deliver to you, Mrs. Mary Dawson, the document that formalizes your compensation for moral and material damages, as well as a letter of recommendation that I hope may help you rebuild your professional life. The envelope passed from his hands to Mary's like an offering of peace, a small gesture of reparation in an ocean of regret. The paper seemed heavy between them, weighted not only with its official contents, but with the burden of a profound transformation of both the man delivering it and the system he represented. Far away in a rather hostile environment, the orange prison uniform seemed particularly harsh against Catherine's delicate skin, accustomed only to fine silks and cashmeres. Her first day in the women's penitentiary was a sequence of humiliations that her arrogance refused to accept. As she entered the common yard, she lifted her chin with disdain, still believing her money and influence would protect her even there. "You don't know who I am," she declared to the group of inmates watching her, her voice still carrying that authoritative tone of someone who always got her way. "In a few days, I'll be out of here, and anyone who helps me will be well rewarded." The silence that followed her words was broken by a collective laughter that echoed off the prison walls. Among the inmates was Veronica Scarr, the same woman Catherine had bribed to assault Mary months earlier. "Look who showed up, girls." Veronica's voice carried a tone of satisfied vengeance. "The madam who thinks she can buy everyone." The other prisoners closed in a tightening circle, their expressions making it clear that Catherine's money held no value there. "You know what we do to people who hurt a child's mother?" one of them asked, while others commented on how they had followed the trial on the prison's television, their sympathies all with Mary Dawson and her little artist daughter. Outside the prison, under the same sky but in a completely different reality, Mary and Emma walked hand in hand through the gardens of the Forum, ready to leave that place behind. Lady Eleanor, Donald Parker, and Attorney Michael accompanied them, but kept a respectful distance, allowing mother and daughter to savor their first true moments of freedom together. Emma carried her backpack full of drawings, now no longer just in dark tones, but exploding in vibrant colors that seemed to want to make up for all the lost time. Mary stopped for a moment, kneeling down to be at eye level with her daughter, her hands gently holding the little face she had dreamed of touching during the long months of separation. "Let's go home, my love," Mary whispered, her voice overflowing with love and gratitude. The gentle afternoon breeze played with both their hair, carrying with it the scent of the flowers from the Forum's garden. The last rays of sun painted the sky in shades of pink and orange, creating an almost magical atmosphere around them. Emma smiled, that pure smile that not even the shadows of injustice could erase, her eyes shining with the same intensity as the sky above. "Look, Mommy," said Emma, rummaging through her worn backpack, her small hands trembling with excitement as she searched for something special. "I made this drawing last night when Mrs. Eleanor told me you'd be coming home." She carefully pulled out a folded piece of paper, and upon opening it, revealed a vibrant image of the two of them in the kitchen of the old mansion, but transformed into something entirely new. In the drawing, the kitchen was no longer just a workplace, but a cozy and lively space. Mary was depicted wearing her favorite apron, the one with flower prints that her mother had given her, and Emma by her side, both preparing what seemed to be the famous chocolate cake. Around them, like smiling guardians, were all those who had helped. Mrs. Eleanor with her maternal affection, Donald Parker with his tireless determination, and the lawyer Michael with his briefcase of documents. "See, Mummy? Now we'll be able to cook together again," Emma explained, her fingers gently tracing the figures on the paper. "And this time it will be in our own kitchen, where no one can separate us." Mary felt warm tears stream down her cheeks as she admired every detail of the drawing. It was more than an illustration. It was a promise of the future, a statement of hope. "It's perfect, my love," she replied, her voice choked with emotion. "And you know what? I'll hang this drawing in our new kitchen to always remind us that love and truth always win in the end." Hand in hand, mother and daughter walked towards the setting sun. Their steps were light, free from the weight of injustice that had kept them apart for so long. The future lay before them like a blank canvas, ready to be filled with all the colors of tomorrow. Did you like Emma and Mary's story? Then subscribe to the channel, Leave your like and check the next one that is waiting for you here on the screen. I'll be waiting for you there.